tiny Chinese twins beg Mountain Man for help. He instantly bursts into tears. That's what they say happened up on Pine Hollow Trail the day two barefoot girls knocked on the door of the most feared man in Coldwater Ridge. Folks claim he hadn't spoken to a soul in 10 years. But when he saw their faces, the tears came fast, as if some ghost from long ago had returned to claim him. Why would a man so hardened by sorrow weep for two strangers? What secret did those little girls carry? And what made the town, once full of fear and silence, finally choose to stand for something good? When the past came knocking and a forgotten man opened his door, everything changed. A single moment of kindness lit a fire in the coldest of places, and in that fire, a new family was forged. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories like this reach beyond mountains, borders, and time. If you still believe in redemption, quiet strength, and standing up for what's right, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from, leave a like if this story moved you, and subscribe so we can keep bringing these tales to life. The wind howled through the broken pine slats of the work camp as smoke rose against the early dusk. Flames licked at the crooked roof of the cookhouse, sending cinders up like fleeing spirits. Two tiny figures darted from the glow, barefoot, thin as shadows, their breath rising in frantic clouds. Leon and May ran without looking back, clutching hands, the only thing they had never let anyone take. Behind them, the heavy voice of the foreman roared over the crackle of fire. "You run and you die cold." But the twins didn't stop. They didn't cry out. They simply ran, silent and swift, into the wilderness. Their feet bled across frozen gravel and snow-pressed mud. Their cotton shirts were soaked with soot and fear, too thin for the season. Leon held a scrap of parchment close to her chest, its creases soft from years of folding. It was the only thing their mother had ever left them, a paper talisman inked with a faded character for protection, sewn into the lining of her apron before the earth swallowed her. It had been weeks since their parents died in the dynamite blast, a so-called accident blamed on poor handling by the foreign laborers. In truth, the fuse had been set early by an impatient overseer who barked orders in English and swung his boot at anyone who dared ask for mercy. When the bodies were buried without ceremony, the girls were told they owed the railroad now, that they were company dependents. What followed was weeks of sweeping ash, fetching wood, scrubbing boots, and silent tears behind barrels. No one came looking for them. No one said their names except each other. Now, as the railroad camp faded behind them into darkness, the girls slipped between trees that whispered like old spirits. The snow was ankle-deep and growing deeper, but Leon pulled May forward, whispering in their mother tongue, "One step more, just one more step." May stumbled, her lips blue. She wanted to sleep, but Leon wouldn't let her. "We find the mountain," she whispered. "Mama said good people live in the mountain. Hidden. They don't talk to townsfolk. But stories like trails are tangled things. All they had was a direction, west of the black rock with the hawk carved in it. They walked toward the moon, praying silently with every step. That night the stars looked down without blinking. The forest grew darker, swallowing their footprints. Somewhere behind them, dogs were unleashed. Men's voices called out with laughter and threat, but the girls were already ghosts to them now, drifting, vanishing deeper into the wild. By dawn, their fingers were stiff, their legs trembling. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. They stopped only when May collapsed beside a fallen log. Leon pulled her up and wrapped them both in a half-burned burlap sack they had taken from the firewood pile. Her own lips whispered the poem from the talisman over and over, though she barely understood its words. He who is lost may still be seen. He who hides may yet be found. And then far up the hill, a thread of smoke curled into the pale sky. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes as the mountains swallowed the twins. Trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their bare arms groaning under the weight of winter. Every branch seemed to watch. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper. Leon and May pressed forward, stepping carefully through powder that rose past their knees. Behind them, the world of men had vanished, replaced by a silence too deep for children to belong in. Their breath came in shallow bursts. Hunger curled in their bellies. The talisman Leon wore around her neck had gone stiff with frost. Back in Coldwater Ridge, two riders from the railroad came in with smoke on their coats and lies on their lips. They leaned against the saloon rail and talked loud, the way men do when they want to be heard. Two little devils ran off into the woods last night. Stole from the company, one said. Foreign-born, wild-eyed. They'll freeze before the wolves find them. That's if they weren't cursed to begin with. A few townsfolk listened with cautious eyes, some sipping coffee by the general store, others behind frosted windows. The word ghost children spread like wind over dry grass. Old Martha Lane, who lived near the creek, claimed she saw two shadows near her chicken coop at dawn. Not a sound, she whispered to the preacher. They moved like wind. One of them was singing in a strange tongue. At the schoolhouse, children spoke in hushed tones about the mountain spirits who took the form of little girls, punished those who lied, and left frost on your door if you didn't leave bread out. The truth never moved as fast as fear. Up in the pines, Leon knew the wolves were following. She didn't need to hear them to feel it. She saw their prints, circles wide around the girl's trail, drawing closer. She kept May close, arm always touching, always ready to lift her if she stumbled. Her lips were cracked and pale. Her voice had grown so quiet that even when she whispered their mother's poem, the sound was nearly lost to the trees. He who is lost may still be seen. When the path forked, Leon stopped. One trail was wide and packed, heading downhill toward what might be another camp. The other was narrow, overgrown, and littered with bones and feathers. May tugged at her sleeve. Which way? Leon stared at the second path. Even the trees bowed differently along it, closer, darker, as if trying to keep something in. She had heard talk in the camp before the fire. The workers warned each other never to take the trail beyond the black pines. They said it led to a man who lived alone, a man with hands big enough to break a mule's neck, a man who hadn't come down to town since before the war. Grizzly Joe, they called him. Half bear, half man, all trouble. But their mother had once said something else long before the accident. Some men hide in mountains not because they're monsters, but because the world treated them like one. Leon didn't fully understand it then, but now holding her sister's shaking hand, she turned toward the dark trail. The wind howled behind them. In the distance, a low growl echoed through the trees, and ahead, far, far up the crooked trail, a wisp of smoke curled into the sky, thin and steady like a promise. The sun had sunk low behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the snow-blanketed trees. The wind had lost its howl and now whispered instead, soft and breathless, as if the forest itself was holding something sacred in its hands. Leon and May reached the edge of the frozen creek, their limbs trembling, their skin pale and tight against their bones. Leon stumbled and caught herself against a crooked pine. May sank to her knees. They had come so far, too far, and now their small bodies refused to move another step. Leon dropped beside her sister, curling around her as best she could. She pressed the talisman against May's heart and whispered the words again, lips numb, voice thin. He who is lost may still be seen. He who hides may yet be found. May's eyes fluttered. A faint breath escaped her lips, misting in the cold. Somewhere beyond the creek, hidden among the rocks and trees like a secret too old to speak of, stood a weather-beaten cabin. Its logs were thick with moss, its roof patched with bark and rusted tin. A single chimney rose above the gables, from which rose a faint ribbon of smoke, constant, thin, and steady. The scent of burning pine drifted through the trees, the only warmth for miles. Inside, Grizzly Joe stood over a pot of boiling roots, the steam rising past his face like ghosts. His beard hung to his chest, gray threaded through with soot. His flannel coat was patched at the elbows. His shoulders were broad, but stooped as if carrying too many winters. He stirred the pot in silence, listening to the world outside with ears trained for danger, not company. He hadn't seen a soul in nearly a year. He hadn't spoken to one in longer. A sound came then, not the wind. Not the creak of trees. A knock, barely audible. He froze, ladle in hand. Another knock, this time a little stronger. 3 quick raps, and then silence. He moved to the door slowly, each step unsure. He reached for the latch with a hand scarred by axe work and time. When he opened it, the cold slapped him, but he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on what lay before him. 2 little girls sat slumped against the stoop. Their faces were nearly blue, cheeks smudged with ash, eyes glassy with frost. Leanne raised her head weakly and held out something in her trembling fingers. It was a folded paper talisman, creased, dirt-smudged, but still intact. Joe looked down at it. For a moment he didn't breathe. The lines on his face deepened as if a dam inside him had cracked. He reached out a shaking hand and took the paper from her. His thumb brushed the faded ink. His knees gave way, and he dropped to the porch beside them. He didn't speak. He just wept. Tears fell into his beard, hot and sudden, like a spring thaw breaking through frozen ground. His breath came in ragged gasps as memories long buried clawed their way back. A woman's face, a child's cry that never came, a night of smoke and silence. He gathered the girls into his arms, not roughly, but as if afraid they might vanish if he blinked. He carried them inside, laid them beside the fire, wrapped them in every quilt he owned. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The talisman lay open on the table beside them, its words catching the firelight like a prayer finally heard. Joe sat beside it, staring into the flames. The snow fell harder outside, covering the world in white. But inside the cabin, for the first time in 10 years, something warm had returned. The fire cracked softly in the stone hearth, its light dancing across the cabin walls like shadows from another life. Joe moved slowly around the room, his heavy boots thudding against the wood floor, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled since he brought the girls inside. He placed an old tin cup of warm broth near their bundled forms, then turned away, resting his calloused hands on the edge of the table, as if to steady himself. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and boiled roots. The wind outside had died down, but the cold still pressed against the windows like a ghost begging entry. Joe didn't speak. He hadn't uttered a word since the moment he saw that talisman. Words were dangerous things. They stirred memories he had spent a decade trying to bury. May stirred beneath the pile of quilts. Her tiny hand crept from beneath the fabric and reached toward the hearth. Leanne, half asleep, curled closer. Joe watched from the corner of the room, unmoving but alert, like some old mountain cat studying a pair of birds who had landed where no birds dared. Eventually, May sat up. She looked around the cabin with wide, dark eyes and then pointed toward the table. Joe followed her gaze and silently pulled the small tin box from beneath the drawer. He opened it and handed her a piece of charcoal and a yellowed scrap of parchment. No words, just a slow nod. She took them gently, almost reverently. May sat cross-legged near the fire, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders like a cape. She began to draw with small, careful lines, the way a child does when trying to remember a face they've only seen in dreams. Joe didn't move, not even when she turned the paper to show him. It was a woman, slender, gentle-eyed, with long hair tied in a cloth. In the corner, 2 tiny girls stood beside her, their hands folded, their smiles faint but full of love. Joe stared at the drawing, his jaw tight. Something in his throat shifted, but he didn't speak. He reached for his axe instead. He went to the bench near the door, sat down heavily, and pulled a whetstone from the box beneath it. The cabin filled with the slow, rhythmic scrape of steel across stone, steady and unbroken. His hands, though strong, trembled as they worked. Every few strokes, he would pause, staring into the firelight, eyes shining. Then he'd begin again. Hours passed like this. May finished her drawing and curled back beside her sister. Joe remained awake, sharpening the blade long after it was sharp enough to split bone. The sound of the whetstone became a kind of prayer, a ritual to hold back the flood of memory. The light of the fire grew lower, casting long shadows that reached toward him like fingers. He hadn't cried in 10 years, not once. But tonight the tears wouldn't stop. He didn't sob. He didn't speak. They simply fell, one by one, carving wet trails down a face weathered by grief. His wife's face lived in that drawing. So did the daughter he never got to hold. And now somehow in this cabin built to keep the world out, two tiny strangers had brought it all rushing back in. The days passed in quiet rhythm, marked only by the creak of wood under boots and the soft rustling of quilts in the morning. Snow still fell beyond the cabin walls, but inside warmth had begun to return, not just from the fire, but from motion, from purpose, from the soft sounds of living. The girls had stopped shivering. Their cheeks held a little color now. Leon no longer watched the door as if expecting men with whips to break it down. May smiled in her sleep. Joe moved through the cabin with his usual care, but something had changed in the way he looked at them. He still said nothing, but he nodded now, once or twice when Leon met his eyes. When she offered her hands to wash the tin cups, he stepped aside. When she took the broom and swept the ash from the hearth, he didn't stop her. She even dared to fetch a few sticks of firewood, dragging them in one by one, teeth clenched from the cold. He watched her from the window, unmoving. When she dropped the last log by the hearth, he placed a hand on her shoulder. Not long, just enough. It was the first human touch they had felt in months. By the end of the week, Joe began leaving the cabin for short stretches. He would disappear into the woods with a worn satchel and return with snared rabbits and strips of birch bark. One morning, without a word, he handed Leanne a smaller satchel and pointed toward the trail that led to the East Ridge. She blinked at him. He didn't speak, but he waited. Finally, she nodded, clutching May's hand, and followed him into the trees. That day, they learned how to spot tracks in the snow. Joe showed them where the rabbits liked to hide, how to tell fresh scat from old, how to bend a sapling just so to trigger a snare. He didn't explain much. He simply did. And they watched. And then they did too. When May caught her first rabbit, he grunted something that almost sounded like a laugh. Evenings returned them to the warmth of the cabin, where they mended what could be mended. Joe laid out broken tools, a handle splintered, a tin cup bent, a trap with a missing tooth. He let Leon hold the hammer, let May twist the wire. They worked in silence, but it was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of shared labor, of slowly built trust. That night the fire burned low and steady. The girls curled beneath their quilts, their faces still smudged with soot but peaceful. Joe sat in his usual place near the table, carving the shaft of a broken tool. His fingers moved slow and steady. The cabin was quiet. Then he spoke. "You remind me?" His voice was rough from disuse, brittle like dry bark. He paused, the words caught like thorns. "Of someone." Leon stirred, but she didn't speak. She looked up at him, waiting. He didn't continue. He set the tool down gently and stared into the flames. His eyes were distant, but no longer empty. Somewhere in that fire, he saw a face he hadn't dared to name in years. The past wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting for something or someone to make him remember that it still mattered. Outside, the snow softened. A bird called once in the dark. Inside the cabin, the silence held its breath. But it was not the same silence that had ruled before. This one made space for healing. And though Joe said nothing more that night, the girls understood something had begun to change. The snow had begun to melt in patches along the southern slope, where the sun touched the earth a little longer each day. Icicles dripped from the eaves, plinking softly like distant chimes. The cold still clung to the mornings, but in the air there was a shift, something subtle, like the breath of spring whispering beneath winter's heavy hand. Joe rose early that morning, earlier than usual. The girls, still drowsy under the quilts, watched him strap on his boots and take down a key from the high beam above the hearth. He didn't speak, only glanced toward the door, then at them. Leon caught the meaning first and nudged May. They followed him out, boots clumsy in the thinning snow, breath puffing white in the still air. He led them around the back of the cabin to a part of the property they hadn't dared explore. There, half covered by drifts and shadows, stood a low structure of wood and glass, its windows clouded with grime, its roof bowed under a thick sheet of ice. A greenhouse, forgotten, sealed shut by time. Joe paused at the door. His hand hovered over the lock for a long moment, then slid the key into the rusted metal. With a click and a push, the door creaked open. Inside, the air was still and bitter, but carried the faintest scent of old life. Rows of raised beds stretched beneath fogged panes. Dead vines coiled in the corners. Shelves held brittle clay pots and empty seed tins. In the far corner, a watering can lay tipped over beside a pile of tools, untouched for years. It was quiet, but not empty, more like something waiting to wake. May stepped forward and touched one of the glass panels. With her sleeve, she wiped a circle clear and leaned close. Her breath fogged it again. Smiling, she drew a flower with her fingertip. 5 round petals, a stem, 2 leaves. Then another. Then another. Soon the entire window bloomed with images. Tulips, daisies, peonies, a tree with blossoms falling like rain. Joe stood behind her, silent. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Slowly he walked to the back shelf and picked up a rusted trowel. He held it out to Leon. She took it with both hands. They spent the rest of the morning clearing dead roots and turning the soil, layer by layer, until the dark earth showed signs of breath again. Joe moved carefully, teaching without speaking, how to loosen the soil, how to scatter the crushed eggshells from the bin beside the stove, how to press a seed into the ground like placing a promise. May hummed softly as she worked, a song without words. They planted early herbs first, parsley, garlic, mint, and onion. Joe brought out a box from the cabin, tucked beneath his cot, and inside were small envelopes labeled in faded ink. Lynn's summer mix, wishing beans, memory root. His hands trembled as he opened them. By the time the sun dipped below the ridge, the beds had been filled and watered. The girls stood at the door of the greenhouse, cheeks pink, hands dirty, hearts full. Joe lingered inside a moment longer. He looked at the corner where Lynn once knelt, tucking seeds into the earth with soft songs and softer smiles. He didn't cry, not this time, but his breath caught, and his chest ached with something he hadn't felt in years, the sting of hope. The greenhouse door closed behind them with a gentle click. Outside, the snow continued to melt, and somewhere beneath the surface, the seeds waited, quiet, unseen, alive. The fire was low that night, casting long orange lines across the cabin walls, the kind that made everything look older, more worn. The wind outside had grown soft, no longer screaming against the eaves, but whispering instead, brushing the windows with the hush of branches moving gently in their sleep. May sat cross-legged on the rug, her small fingers moving over a square of worn parchment, smoothing its creases with quiet care. Leon watched her, then turned to Joe, who sat sharpening a knife by the hearth. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled the paper free. Without a word, she crossed the room and held it out to him. Joe looked up slowly. His hands paused mid-motion. He stared at the small hand holding the yellowed paper, at the cautious eyes that searched his face. He took the talisman, rough fingers brushing over the delicate script. He had seen it before. The ink was faded, but the brushstrokes were unmistakable, careful, fluid, strong in their simplicity. 4 lines of Chinese characters curved down the page like a river winding through a mountain. Above them, written in smaller script, was a name, a woman's name. Joe's lips parted, but no sound came. "Do you know what it says?" Leanne asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joe swallowed hard. His eyes stayed fixed on the paper, unmoving, unblinking. "It's a protection blessing," he said at last, voice like gravel dragged over stone. "An old one. I've seen it before." His thumb traced the characters. "Lynn used to write them for the other women in camp. She said they were prayers, meant to guard against grief." He stopped. The cabin fell silent again. "Lynn?" Leanne echoed. "That was our mother's sister's name." Joe turned his head slowly, eyes sharp, but dazed. "Your mother, what was her name?" "Ying. Chen Ying." Joe sat back as if the wind had struck him square in the chest. The knife slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. He looked at the talisman again, then at the girls, then again at the trembling parchment. His voice was hoarse. "Lynn's name was Chen Lin. She came here from Guangzhou. Her father had a brother who stayed behind with a younger daughter. She used to say that daughter might come find her one day." His voice broke. "But she never got the chance to send word." Leon stepped forward, brow furrowed. "She was our mother's sister? Really?" Joe nodded once. "She was my wife." He set the talisman down gently on the table, as though it were something sacred. His hands shook. His breath came slow and uneven, but not from fear. It was as if something long frozen had cracked within him, and now the thaw came rushing in all at once. The girls said nothing. They moved to either side of him, and for a long moment, none of them spoke. Joe looked down at their faces, small, round, eyes dark like Lynn's, brows that furrowed the same way when they were puzzled, the same silent strength in the way they stood. He reached for the talisman once more, this time holding it not as a relic, but as a bond. "You carry her spirit," he whispered, "and now I carry you." Outside, the snow had stopped. Moonlight spilled across the trees like a path being drawn from heaven down to the roof of that quiet cabin, where something long lost had been found again. And though the silence returned, it was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of a name, spoken once more, and the fragile weight of something like family beginning to take root. The wind howled with sudden fury, fierce and biting, as if the mountain itself had taken offense at the stillness below. Trees groaned under the weight of gathering snow, and the clouds above had turned an iron gray, heavy with more to come. Joe stood outside the greenhouse, axe in hand, splitting logs with slow, deliberate swings. Each strike sent steam rising from his skin. The girls were inside the cabin, kneeling near the hearth, organizing bundles of dried herbs and sorting through the tools Joe had taught them to mend. It was May who saw him first, a shadow stumbling through the tree line, hunched and swaying, barely more than a shape against the snow. She pressed her face to the window and blinked hard. "There's someone," she whispered. Joe dropped the axe before she'd finished the sentence and moved to the cabin door. By the time he stepped onto the porch, the figure had collapsed into the snow just beyond the fence. Joe's boots crunched across the frozen path. The man was half buried already, one arm stretched forward as though he had been reaching for something unseen. Joe knelt, turned him over gently, and saw a gaunt face, bearded, blue-lipped, wrapped in the collar of a long wool coat stiff with frost. A black satchel hung from his shoulder. Joe hoisted him without a word and carried him into the warmth. Hours passed before the man spoke. He lay beneath heavy quilts, a tin cup of broth steaming beside him. The color had started to return to his face, but his eyes were still sunken and watchful, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much road and not enough mercy. "You're Grizzly Joe," he said at last, voice hoarse but sure. Joe didn't confirm it. He sat near the fire, sharpening his skinning knife, his eyes flicking up only once. The man chuckled weakly. "Thought so." Leon offered the man a small bowl of roots. He thanked her softly, then turned back to Joe. "I'm Reverend Elijah Cole. Been following the tracks of men far worse than wolves." He sipped the broth and set the cup down. "A cleanup crew left Coldwater Ridge 4 days ago. Railroad men with dogs and rifles. They say 2 runaways torched a supply shack and stole property. Chinese girls. Said they was reclaiming what's theirs." Joe's hand froze on the blade. "They've got posters, lies printed in bold, offering coin for anyone who brings the girls back." The preacher looked over at the twins, now huddled close together, eyes wide with fear. "They're coming this way, following sign in the snow." Joe stood slowly. The knife he held gleamed in the firelight. He sheathed it, then moved to the corner of the cabin and pulled down a long-barreled rifle, its wood polished, its barrel oiled and ready. He laid it on the table. Then he fetched the smaller rifle Lynn once used, cleaned it, and checked its chamber. It hadn't been touched in nearly a decade. The preacher watched him, eyes calm. "They'll bring more than fear. They'll bring fire." Joe nodded once. "Then let 'em burn." He moved through the cabin like a storm in still air, boarding windows, stacking wood by the door, filling buckets with water. The girls followed silently, fetching tools, unrolling old blankets, covering the greenhouse with tarps. It was not panic that filled the cabin. It was purpose, the kind that comes when a man has something worth standing for. As the first flakes of the new storm began to fall, Reverend Cole leaned back and whispered a prayer, not for Joe, but for the men who dared to come after what wasn't theirs. Because now the girls weren't alone, and the mountain would not give them up without a fight. The storm raged through the night, pressing against the cabin like a wild animal, testing every seam. But inside, the fire burned steady, and the walls held strong. The preacher sat in a chair near the hearth, hands clasped over his knees, his worn Bible resting on the table unopened. The girls had fallen asleep hours before, curled like kittens beneath a thick quilt, their breath rising in soft rhythms. Joe sat across from him, carving a piece of cedar. His knife moved in patient strokes, shaping something from the block without any clear form. Just motion, just purpose. Reverend Cole had watched him work for near an hour before he spoke. "She was a good woman," the preacher said quietly. "The one who wrote that talisman." Joe's hand slowed, but did not stop. "I seen enough of this world to know the mark of someone who healed, not hurt, the kind that's rare." The preacher shifted slightly. "And the way you looked at those girls, that wasn't just kindness. That was grief with roots." Joe set the wood down. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath, heavy as snowfall on a roof ready to break. "She was called Lynn," he said at last. His voice, quiet and low, seemed to come from a place deeper than memory, like a stone pulled up from a frozen lake bed. "Came west with her father. He worked the mines. She made medicines, tea for the cough, salves for the burns, things the doctor never understood. Folks came to her at night when no one could see, then gossiped about her by day." The preacher said nothing. He only listened. Joe's eyes remained fixed on the fire. "They said she was cursed, that she brought bad luck. But I saw her, how she looked at people, how she waited for the right word before speaking. She never pushed. She just gave." He paused. "I married her, out near Dry Creek, under a pine that don't grow anymore. Some spit when they saw us. Others just turned away. One night, someone set fire to our cabin, called it an accident. Said a lantern tipped over. The room fell silent, the fire popping softly. She was inside, Joe continued, pregnant with our first. I was away, chopping wood, too far to hear her scream. He clenched his jaw. I buried them myself. The baby wasn't born, and the town didn't even come to the fire line. His voice dropped lower, nearly a whisper. I left, built this place with my hands, promised I'd never speak to anyone from that town again. 10 years now. The preacher leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And yet, here you are, letting two little souls into your home and me. Joe looked over at the sleeping girls. They came out of the dark, starving, scared, but they didn't ask for anything. Just stood there, holding that talisman, her handwriting, her name, like she'd sent them. Reverend Cole's eyes shone with quiet awe. You think they're her kin? I don't know, Joe said, but they carry her calm, her quiet. Even the way May watches the trees before she speaks. It's the same, like she's waiting to see if the land approves. The preacher nodded slowly. And maybe it does. Joe didn't answer, but when he picked up the carving again, it began to take shape. Small, rounded, two faces side by side. Twin figures emerging from the wood, held in the arms of something larger. Something that had waited too long in silence. Outside, the storm howled louder, but it could not enter. Not anymore. Coldwater Ridge never liked to choose sides. It was the sort of town that kept its head down, its mouth shut, and its hands in its own pockets. Folks lived close, but not together. Gossip passed through slanted glances and half whispers, and justice had always been the kind that looked the other way. So when the railroad men rode in with snow still packed to their boots and lies packed even tighter in their mouths, the town did what it always did first, listened without speaking. The foreman, a square-shouldered brute with a face carved from granite and a voice that could split barn doors, strutted down Main Street like he owned it. His coat flapped in the wind like a banner, and his boots stomped across the porch of the saloon with purpose. 3 men followed behind, big, blank-eyed, armed. One held a bundle of damp paper under his arm. The posters went up fast, tacked to the outside of the general store, nailed to the church bulletin board, pasted on the stable walls. Each one bore the same crude drawing, 2 small girls, faces sketched in angry lines, beneath bold black words, wanted runaways. Property of Central Union Railroad, reward for return, no questions asked. Inside the store, a few folks gathered near the windows, watching. Mrs. Halber, who sold thread and salt by the ounce, whispered to the schoolteacher, "Runaways? From where?" The teacher frowned, shaking her head. "They look like children, not thieves." The foreman didn't care who believed him. He barked the story loud and rehearsed so well it sounded like truth. 2 Chinese girls set fire to a company cookhouse, stole from the foreman's quarters, vanished into the woods like ghosts, dangerous, probably diseased. Railroad property, taken in after their family failed their contract. We just want what's ours. He slammed a silver coin on the bar at the saloon. Double that if you bring them in alive. Half for dead. A few men coughed into their sleeves. No one took the coin, but no one said no either. By dusk, the posters had caught the wind. They flapped and flared in the cold like warnings written in flame. One blew all the way to the trail leading out of town, where Joe came to trade for flour and coffee. He saw it pinned to the gate outside the tannery. He stopped walking. His breath froze in the air. He stepped closer. The sketch was poor, but he recognized the tilt of Leon's chin, the way May's braids curled at the ends. He looked at the word property as if it were fire. His fists clenched. The paper crumpled under his hand as he tore it down. A passer-by glanced at him, paused, then kept walking. Inside the general store, The clerk stiffened when Joe entered, but he said nothing. Joe dropped the coin for the flower and left without a word. On the way out of town, he passed the preacher, standing near the church doors, looking down at another poster in his hand. Their eyes met. Joe didn't speak. He just nodded, once sharp, and turned back toward the mountains. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had darkened, and his jaw was tight with silence. He hung the torn poster beside the fireplace. The girls stared at it, lips parted. Leanne looked to him with eyes that asked 1,000 questions. Joe didn't answer with words. He picked up his rifle, checked the chamber, and placed it beside the door. Because this time, Coldwater Ridge wouldn't get to pretend it didn't know. This time someone was coming, and someone else was ready. The bell above the general store door jingled for the third time that morning, and Mrs. Halber barely looked up from her ledgers. Coldwater Ridge had grown restless since the posters went up. Snow was melting in slow patches across the roofs, and with it came something more dangerous than ice. Talk. The kind of talk that bloomed in quiet corners, passed from hand to hand like a match with too much dry wood waiting. "They say he's hiding them," muttered old man Fisher as he tugged at his gloves. "Up in that cabin of his, the twins." "Ghost children," hissed someone behind him. "Came out of nowhere after burning down a cookhouse." "Or maybe," offered young Clara, the teacher, as she folded a note into her coat pocket, "maybe they're just children." Silence fell for a moment, just long enough to feel the divide. "They're cursed," someone else muttered. "Foreign devils like their kind always bring trouble. Remember what happened when he married that woman?" That woman. Lynn. The name hung in the air like smoke no one wanted to inhale. Across the street, beyond the windows streaked with frost, an older woman stood quietly outside the chapel, Miss Beatrice Lang, the town midwife. She hadn't spoken much in years, not since her husband died in the flood, and the town forgot how to thank healers. But she listened, and she remembered. She remembered Lynn. She remembered the night she climbed the mountain path with her kit strapped to her back and prayers whispered on her lips. The baby had come too soon. The fire had taken hold before morning. She delivered the child, still, silent, and watched Joe crumple like a tree split down the middle. She had held Lynn's hand as the smoke blackened the sky. She had seen the look in the townspeople's eyes when they spoke Lynn's name with disdain, not grief. Now she watched them speak of the twins as if they were demons, not daughters. Inside the chapel, Reverend Cole read from the book of Proverbs. A few pews were full, most were empty. Miss Lang walked in mid-sermon, a rare enough sight that heads turned. She didn't stop at a pew. She walked straight to the front and placed something on the altar, a folded slip of parchment, brown with age, the edges soft. "I kept it," she said, her voice clear. "Lynn wrote it for her sister before the fire. I never posted it. I didn't know how. It mentions 2 girls, twin daughters, just born. She meant to send it to Guangzhou." A hush fell over the room like a cloth. The preacher stepped forward. He opened the note with careful hands and read aloud a few lines in broken Chinese, then the English beneath it. Lynn's own translation. "May they carry our name with courage. May they be seen. May they find the good places in this world where the cruel do not rule." Miss Lang turned to face the gathered townsfolk, eyes wet but unwavering. "Those girls aren't devils. They're kin. Blood to a woman this town turned its back on. If we turn our backs again, the shame is ours to carry." No one spoke for a long time. Then Clara rose, then the butcher's wife, then the clerk's boy. A slow shift began, like thawed earth waking after a bitter season. Out front, the posters still fluttered, but fewer than before. A few had gone missing, quietly pulled down in the night. And somewhere far up the trail, a mountain man watched the horizon with steady hands and kindling in his heart, still unaware that the wind was beginning to change in his favor. The snow had begun to retreat from the rocks and stumps along the trail as the first signs of spring crept through the mountains. Meltwater ran in thin silver ribbons down the slope, pooling in the low places, trickling beneath the moss that had slept for months. The cabin stood silent under the soft gray sky, smoke curling gently from its chimney like a breath finally exhaled. Joe was tending to the soil in the greenhouse when he heard the crunch of careful footsteps beyond the trees. Not rushed, not afraid, just sure. He wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped out to meet whoever dared the long walk this deep in the pass. Beatrice Lang stood at the edge of the garden beds, her coat dusted with pine needles, her boots soaked halfway to the knee. Her face looked thinner than he remembered, but her eyes, those same steady, knowing eyes from so long ago, held firm. "I kept something I shouldn't have," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "Didn't know if it mattered then, but I reckon I was wrong." She opened her satchel with stiff fingers and pulled out a small black Bible, worn at the edges, the kind given to women who needed comfort more than rules. She passed it to Joe without ceremony. He turned it over in his hands, brows furrowed. "Inside," she said, "page marked with red thread." Joe opened it, flipping gently through the pages until he reached the marker. Folded neatly between the thin paper was a letter, aged, fragile, but intact. The envelope bore Lynn's handwriting. His throat closed. "I was meant to send it to her sister in Guangzhou," Beatrice continued, "but the fire happened. And afterward, I was afraid. The town had no mercy then. I didn't think it would matter anymore. But those girls, they look like her." Joe sat on the porch step and unfolded the letter with shaking hands. The girls, curious, came out and stood beside him. Leon took May's hand. Joe cleared his throat, but his voice cracked on the first word. He paused, started again. "To my sister Ying," he read slowly, "I hope this letter finds you safe, and that the spring flowers bloom bright along the riverbanks. I write to you with joy in my heart. I am with child, a daughter I am sure. She kicks with great spirit. Joseph, my husband, tends to me like the roots tend to the tree. Quiet, strong, always there." His voice grew softer. "We live far from the town, by the mountains, where the sky is large and the water is clear. I pray one day you will visit, and that our children will laugh together among the herbs I grow. I miss you more than words will hold." Joe's hand dropped to his lap, the letter trembling in his grip. Tears slid down his cheeks, unchecked. Leon stepped forward and touched the edge of the paper. "She wrote about us," she whispered. Joe nodded. "She hoped you would come. She wanted family." May climbed into his lap without asking, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Leon leaned into his side, resting her head against his shoulder. Joe closed his eyes and pulled them both close. The letter still clutched in his fist like a lifeline thrown across years of silence. "They may not be yours by blood," Beatrice said, voice quiet, "but they were meant for you just the same." Joe said nothing. He didn't have to. His tears answered for him. And in that moment, beneath a sky turning silver with the promise of thaw, the line between past and present blurred, and something long broken began to mend. The pines were burning. It started at the tree line just before dawn, when the frost still clung to the needles and the birds had not yet begun their song. A thick, oily smoke slithered through the low brush, rising in slow spirals at first, then spreading with purpose, unnatural and hungry. Sparks leapt from log to log like they had been waiting for the order. And they had. The foreman stood at the edge of the ridge with a cigar clenched between his teeth, watching the blaze climb the mountain shoulder. Behind him, his men moved with practiced ease. Torches, oil, matches. "Smoke him out," he growled. "Flush the bastard like a fox from its hole." Down in the hollow, Joe woke to the scent before the sound. His eyes snapped open, trained by years of silence and instinct. Smoke, pine smoke, but wrong. Too thick, too dark. He rose and went to the door. One looked toward the east and he saw it. Fire licking up the slope, orange tongues curling through blackened trunks. He turned back into the cabin, voice low but firm. "Get your boots, both of you, now." The girls didn't ask questions. Leanne grabbed their coats while May stuffed the talisman and Lynn's letter into her satchel. Joe packed quick, water, bread, rifle. Then he bent low, arms wide, and the girls climbed up without hesitation. One clung to his back, the other around his chest. He wrapped them both in a blanket, tied it tight, and stepped into the smoke. The air was thick, choking, and every breath burned. Embers swirled like angry wasps through the underbrush. Joe moved with steady steps, boots crushing through ash, hands clenched tight around an axe in one fist, a shovel strapped across his back. The fire tried to close around them, but Joe knew these woods better than any man alive. He took the old wash trail, narrow, steep, half forgotten, but it was clean of brush and choked with snow melt. It would hold. He didn't speak, just moved. Through smoke and shadow, through coughing fits and tears, he carried them. Not once did he stumble, not once did he stop. They broke through the edge of the forest just as the morning sun rose behind the haze. The town of Coldwater Ridge lay sprawled below, blurry through the smoke, quiet in its waking. Joe kept walking, out from the tree line, black with soot, coat torn, beard singed. The girls held fast, their faces hidden in his neck. He reached the town square and stopped in the middle of the road. He turned to face the ridge, the fire behind him throwing flames high into the sky. His axe gleamed in one hand, the shovel in the other. His shirt hung open at the chest, revealing old scars. Thick and pale, burn marks across his side, faded lash lines from years past. The kind of scars that told stories no man ever said aloud. The townspeople gathered slowly. First a few, then a crowd. They stared at him, at the soot-covered giant with two girls on his shoulders, standing like a sentinel in front of the blaze. No one spoke, until Clara stepped forward. "You brought them through that?" she asked. Joe nodded once. Miss Lang pushed to the front, eyes wide. "They set that fire on purpose. The railroad wants what doesn't belong to it," Joe said, his voice rough but clear. "And they'll burn everything to take it." The preacher arrived next, arms spread wide, soot on his collar. "Then let's not let them." And that was all it took. One by one, the townsfolk turned. Boots stomped, voices rose, buckets were passed, tools raised. The forge opened early. Men and women grabbed what they could, because the fire had come to them now. And the man they once called a monster had walked through it carrying something precious, something worth saving. The church bell rang at high noon, sharp and sudden, cutting through the smoky air that still clung to the valley. The sound echoed off the hillsides like a call to judgment, a sound the people of Coldwater Ridge hadn't heard in months, some not in years. The pews filled quickly, neighbors elbow to elbow, many with soot still smudged across their collars, hands still blistered from the morning's fire line. The heat from the ridge still hung in their clothes, but something else stirred beneath it now. Righteousness worn like armor. At the pulpit stood Reverend Cole, his Bible closed, hands resting gently on its cracked leather cover. He did not speak yet. He waited, calm as a pond before the storm. The back doors burst open, and in strode the foreman, hat low, coat crisp, face tight with triumph. Behind him came three of his railroad men, thick-necked and scowling, rifles strapped across their backs. The foreman looked around as if the place offended him. "I'll be brief," he barked, tossing a poster onto the front pew. "These girls belong to Central Union. They were taken by force, and I demand they be returned. That man, he jabbed a thick finger toward Joe, harbored them, stole them, hid them. That's company property. I have full authority to act. The church murmured, a ripple of unease moving through the pews. Joe stood at the center of the aisle, his broad shoulders blocking the view of the girls seated just behind him, their hands folded, faces still and watchful. The preacher raised a hand. You'll have your chance to speak, but this town speaks too, and it listens. Joe stepped forward. He looked out over the congregation, then down at his calloused hands. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his coat and laid something on the altar. First, the talisman, creases worn soft from a child's fingers. Then the letter, Lynn's words folded with care, marked with hope. My wife wrote this, he said, voice low but clear. She died because this town turned its back. And now her sister's daughters came out of the dark looking for what was taken. Not gold, not land, just shelter, just a name. He turned to the preacher, then to the crowd. You all knew Lynn. Some of you came to her when the cough took your children, when the burns wouldn't heal. And some of you looked the other way when they blamed her for things she never touched. You know what this is. You know who they are. Miss Lang rose from her pew. She walked slowly to the front, hands trembling, but her voice rang steady. I delivered Lynn's stillborn child. I held her hand the night she died, and I kept that letter for 10 years out of shame. I see these girls, and I see what I failed to protect then. Clara stood next, followed by the butcher, then the miller's wife, then others. One by one, voices joined, rising above the silence. They're not thieves. They're not property. They're family, the foreman scoffed. This is sentiment, not law. But Reverend Cole stepped down from the pulpit and opened the letter. Law without justice is just power, and we won't be ruled by power any longer. He placed his hand over the talisman. These girls are under our protection now. A pause, then a single clap, then another. Then the sound of hands joined together filled the old church like thunder rolling through a dry canyon. Applause not just for the girls, but for something greater, repentance, rising from ash. The foreman backed toward the door, face hard, unreadable. But he said no more. In the pew, the girls looked at Joe with wide eyes, and he nodded once. This wasn't over, but for the first time, they weren't alone. The sky above Coldwater Ridge was a pale blue that morning, thin and high, like the world had finally taken a breath after too many days of smoke and silence. The mountains still held their snow, but down in the valley, the thaw had begun. Water trickled along the roadside, down into ditches, feeding the earth beneath tired feet. And yet, despite the promise of spring, the people of Coldwater Ridge stood in the town square, with shoulders squared and jaws set tight. They waited not for weather, but for justice. The foreman stood near the well, arms folded, his coat now dusty from the trail, boots cracked from fire and frost alike. His men lingered behind him like dogs grown uncertain of their leash. Across the square, Joe stood alone, the girls behind him once more, his rifle slung across his back, his stance wide and steady. The townsfolk filled the space between, quiet but firm, and at the front, wearing his badge pinned to a worn leather vest, stood Sheriff Tom Ellery, the man who had spoken little and done even less in the last 10 years, until now. He cleared his throat, a dry rasp that cut through the still air like a saw through pine. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, but he didn't draw it. He didn't need to. I've been sheriff of this town longer than some of you been drawing breath, he said, eyes scanning the faces around him. And I've made my share of mistakes, turned away when I should have stood up, but I ain't gonna do that again. He looked at the girls, then at Joe. These children are under the protection of Joseph Cartwright. As far as this town's concerned, they are no one's property. They are free, and any man who tries to lay hands on them will answer to me. The foreman's lip curled. You got no authority to say that. You're just a county man. These girls belong to the Central Union. The law says. Before he could finish, he stepped forward and raised a fist, swift and ugly. It was meant for Joe's jaw, but it never landed. 3 men grabbed him mid-swing. Tom Ellery himself, the butcher, and Reverend Cole. The crowd surged, not wild but determined, pulling the foreman back, stripping him of threat. His hat fell to the dirt. He sputtered and cursed, face flushed, but no one backed away. Miss Lang stepped forward, holding a letter high in her hand. This came on the morning mail, she said, from Central Union's legal office, addressed to Coldwater Ridge, marked urgent. The preacher took it and read aloud. To whom it may concern, the actions taken by Foreman Clay Trask concerning the retrieval of minor dependents at the Coldwater Ridge site have not been authorized by Central Union Rail. The aforementioned dependents are not listed on any legal contract or bound agreement. Any use of company resources to claim custody constitutes an overreach and violation of employment terms. Immediate suspension and investigation are hereby ordered. Silence, then murmurs. Then the foreman's men began to step back, their shoulders slumped, eyes darting. The foreman stood alone. Sheriff Ellery stepped forward and unpinned his badge. Trask, he said, voice firm, you're relieved of any say in this valley. You set fires on land that wasn't yours. You came for what wasn't yours. And you lied. The badge glinted in the sun as he pinned it back to his chest. Now get off our mountain. The foreman hesitated, then turned. No one followed him. The town turned its gaze back to Joe. The girls stepped to his side, each gripping one of his hands. No more running, no more hiding. Justice had found its voice in the mountains, and this time it spoke the truth. The sound of hammering echoed through the trees like a heartbeat, slow and steady. Birds had returned to the valley, their songs timid at first, now bold as the days grew warmer. Spring had laid its claim on the land, and with it came something else, something gentler than justice, quieter than survival. It was peace growing root by root in the soft earth around Joe's cabin. Out back, beneath the open sky, Joe stood over a fresh-cut plank of pine wood, smoothing its edges with long strokes of his plane. The old table in the cabin had served him well enough, scarred and uneven as it was, but it had never been meant for more than one. Now things had changed. 3 chairs sat beside him, each hand-carved. The smallest was for May, rounded at the arms, legs just short enough for her feet to dangle. Leon's was taller, with a carved flower pressed into the backrest, her doing, though Joe had helped steady her hand. The third was simple and wide, its frame solid, its joints tight. Joe sat there only when he read aloud at night, voice low and stumbling, but growing stronger with each attempt. Inside the cabin, Leon crouched beside the hearth, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration as she copied letters from a slate into a journal. Mountain, she whispered, tracing each line carefully. Family. May sat beside her, humming softly, practicing her strokes with a stick dipped in ash water, drawing symbols Joe couldn't yet read, but recognized as beautiful all the same. The girls had taken to learning like saplings to sun. Clara, the teacher, had sent up books from the schoolhouse, along with chalk, slates, and ink pots. Each day after chores, Joe would sit with them, head bowed, listening as they read aloud in 2 languages, their mother's and his. Sometimes he didn't understand the words, but he understood their voices, steady, proud, unafraid. The greenhouse behind the cabin had bloomed early, as if it too had been waiting for someone to speak its name again. Green leaves pushed up through the soil, stretching toward the light. Parsley, mint, garlic. Small white flowers opened on the tomato vines. The girls kept careful watch, watering each row with care, whispering greetings to each new sprout. Joe caught himself smiling when he watched them, unconsciously at first, then fully, without shame. His face had forgotten the shape of that expression, but it remembered quickly. One Sunday morning, Reverend Cole arrived with a package wrapped in cloth. He handed it to May, who opened it carefully. "A Bible," the preacher said. "Two columns, one in English, one in Chinese, so you'll never forget where you come from or where you're going." Joe turned the pages slowly, running a finger along the delicate characters. Lynn's words lived here too, in spirit if not in ink. He nodded once, eyes wet, but steady. That night the girls set the new table. Bowls of stew, slices of bread, and early greens from the greenhouse. Joe sat in his chair and watched as Leon placed the talisman at the center, and May set Lynn's letter beside it. He looked at the faces across from him, bright, tired, alive. The fire crackled. The wind outside rustled through the new leaves. Joe smiled. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel like a man hiding in the woods. He felt like a father, sitting at his table, in a home built not of wood and nails, but of grace. The meadow had never looked so full. Wildflowers spread like a quilt of color across the green, fluttering in the breeze as if the earth itself was dressed for something sacred. The snow had long melted from the valley, and the mountain watched in silence as townsfolk from Coldwater Ridge gathered at the edge of the clearing with baskets of bread, jars of honey, and arms ready to work. It wasn't a festival in name, but it felt like one, part solemn, part joyful, all of it stitched together with something more enduring than celebration. It was belonging. Joe stood near the center of the meadow with a shovel in one hand and a sapling peach tree in the other. The girls stood beside him, their hands clean, their hair tied back with new ribbons that Clara had brought up from town. May wore her mother's talisman proudly around her neck, and Leon carried a bundle wrapped in canvas, something she'd made but hadn't yet revealed. Near the tree line, Miss Lang waited with her arms crossed, her usual stoicism softening under the weight of the day. Reverend Cole, dressed in his cleanest shirt and holding the Bible he'd gifted weeks before, nodded to Joe. The time had come. The grave was simple, a stone, hand-carved, worn by years of wind and snow. Lynn's name, etched in both English and Chinese, sat quietly among the roots of an old cedar. Joe approached slowly, cleared a patch of grass, and drove the shovel into the soil. The crowd watched without a word. No speeches, no declarations. Just dirt, a tree, and hands that knew the worth of labor. He dug the hole, then stepped aside. Leon helped lower the sapling, and May poured the first cup of water from a wooden ladle Joe had carved. The preacher finally spoke, voice low, steady. "Let this tree bear witness. Let it bloom every spring and remind us that even in sorrow, new life rises." A soft wind moved through the clearing as if in agreement. Then came the paper. Reverend Cole reached into his coat and unfolded a document signed with 3 names: Joseph Cartwright, Beatrice Lang, Thomas Ellery. The preacher read it aloud. "This day, in witness of community and grace, the town of Coldwater Ridge recognizes the legal guardianship and full parental rights of Joseph Cartwright over Leon and May, twin daughters of Ying Chen, nieces of the late Lin Chen Cartwright." The crowd broke into soft applause, some clapping slow and unsure, others letting out a cheer. Joe said nothing. He placed a hand on each girl's shoulder and gave a single nod, but the smile that crossed his face spoke volumes. Later that afternoon, as the town shared food and laughter among the flowers, Joe sat on a stump and pulled out a small harmonica from his coat pocket. It was old, its edges worn smooth, but its notes still rang clear. He handed it to May, then placed her fingers over the holes. "Breathe in, then out, like the wind through the trees." She tried, a squeak, then a low, steady note. Joe chuckled, a rare sound. That's music enough. Leon sat nearby with her carving knife, working patiently on a piece of pine. When she finished, she held it up. A small bear, round and gentle-faced, its paws stretched outward like it meant to protect. She handed it to Joe. "It's you," she said simply. He turned it over in his hands, thumb tracing its edges. "You made this?" Leon nodded. Joe held it close, then placed it at the foot of Lynn's grave, beside the sapling. She would have liked that. The sun sank lower, casting the meadow in golden light. Laughter rang out as townsfolk danced. Children ran between flowers, and stories were told around fresh loaves of bread and jars of preserves. But at the edge of it all stood a family of three, made not by blood, but by choice, by grief, and by something even stronger. Roots, the kind that grow deep and hold on through any storm. The cabin still stood, its logs darkened by time, its roof patched and repatched with love. Moss crept up the stones along the chimney, and the path from the greenhouse to the porch had been worn smooth by decades of footsteps, small and large. The mountains wrapped around it just the same as they always had. Stoic, vast, eternal. But the air no longer felt heavy with silence. It rang now with voices, with songs, with the gentle clatter of dishes and the scratch of pencils on paper. It rang with life. Inside, the fire glowed low in the hearth. Above it hung a portrait, roughly painted, the lines imperfect, but unmistakable. Joseph Cartwright, his shoulders broad, eyes kind beneath a heavy brow, stared forward with that quiet strength he had always carried, even when he thought he had none left. A wooden bear sat beneath the frame, still polished from years of hands touching it in passing. A harmonica, worn but intact, rested beside it on the mantel. Two children sat cross-legged on the rug, their eyes wide, their hands wrapped around mugs of sweet tea. Across from them, in the rocking chair by the window, Leon spoke with a voice softened by age but still steady as stone. "You wouldn't know it to look at this place now," she said, "but once upon a time, this mountain tried to swallow us whole." The children leaned closer. May stood by the window, her own gray hair tied back in a long braid, watching the tree line. She smiled faintly, listening to her sister's voice weave the story one more time. "We were just little things," Leon continued. "Barely 8. Lost everything in the blink of an eye. All we had was a piece of paper, a name, and each other. And we found him, Grizzly Joe. Folks in town thought he was a monster, but he was the only man who ever looked at us and didn't see a burden." One of the children whispered, "But he was big and scary, right?" Leon chuckled. "Big, yes. Scary. Only to the people who deserve to be scared. To us, he was the safest place in the world. He taught us to trap, to plant, to carve. But more than that, he gave us a home when we didn't know what that word meant anymore." May turned from the window and joined them, kneeling beside the children. She opened an old Bible and placed it gently on the floor. Inside was a letter, still folded with care, and a talisman, edges frayed, ink faded but never forgotten. "He kept these," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "all his life, and now we keep them, because remembering is part of the healing." Outside, the peach tree by Lynn's grave was heavy with blossoms. Bees moved lazily through the petals. The greenhouse stood taller now, with fresh panes of glass and rows of vegetables tended by new hands. A schoolhouse had been built farther down the ridge, and the path between it and the cabin was marked by tiny footprints and laughter. The mountain had not changed in its shape. It still loomed, still cast long shadows. But those shadows no longer frightened anyone. They were part of the place now, like the laughter, like the songs, like the stories passed from mouth to ear, generation after generation. Joe's cabin was no longer a place of hiding. It was a place of memory, of love, of quiet strength. It was a monument not carved in stone, but in time, in children's voices, in every seed planted and every hand held. The mountains remembered, and they whispered gently to all who came near. Here goodness prevailed. Here sorrow gave way to joy. Here the lost were found.